Welcome to the Storypowers podcast, the show about the power of stories, the people who tell them, and why you should be doing it too. I'm your host, keynote speaker and storytelling coach, Francisco Mahfuz. My guest today is Ben White. Ben is a director at Titus Talent Strategies, and he's an expert on all things recruitment. He's making a name for himself on social media as a respected voice on talent acquisition, retention, leadership, and culture. As you might have noticed, Ben is not a storyteller, a professional speaker, a marketing or a branding expert. So what the hell is he doing on my podcast? Well, he's here because I wanted to explore how storytelling fits in someone's career, from the story told by your CV and past experience, all the way to the stories candidates and recruiters tell about themselves and the companies they represent. And also because Ben has the most piercing green eyes I've ever seen, so I needed an excuse to stare at them for an hour. Ladies and gentlemen, Ben White. Ben, welcome to the show.
Thank you. What an intro. How could I not be enthused now? Ready to go and talk. Excited to be here.
So I've not had to interview for quite a while. So how about this for a strategy? Can I just sit down in front of an interviewer and say, you know who I am, you know what I've done, let's do this?
It's a bold strategy. I probably wouldn't recommend. Probably wouldn't recommend it.
Oh man, interviews. I don't miss them. I think that even when I did interview, and this was a very long time ago, but when I interviewed, it was, a referral from someone else. I was doing the exact same job. So I think I've missed most of the bullshit that seems to go on nowadays with this like, tell me about yourself and, strengths, weaknesses, all this malarkey that seems to be prevalent in today's interview, in the interviewing culture today. So the very first thing I wanted to ask you was, when it comes to someone's CV, so what is best practice today for how you put together a CV, and how much does someone need to figure out what story that CV is telling, other than just, writing down everything that they've done?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I remember when you and I first started talking about me coming on, and I started to think, like, what do stories play? What role do they play in interviewing? And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that they play a massive part. And that starts at the CV. So when you're talking about a resume, I think storytelling might be a little bit different, depending on the medium. But in a resume and a CV, the story is quantifying your impact, right? I think a lot of people said, hey, I've done this. But when I think of a resume, when I think of a CV, the story is, well, in the first 18 months I was there, by implementing blank, I was able to reduce downtime from 50 to 20%, resulting in a cost savings of blank. And that's, it's not Avatar, that's not like an amazing, compelling story. But for a resume, that is so important to say, this is what I did. I think so many people miss that on a resume. You want to make sure it's grammatically correct. You want to make sure it's accurate. You want to make sure that people can follow it and see, okay, this is their career arc. If you really want to be effective, I think it's important to show, this is how I have positively impacted my previous employers. And that's kind of the story of a CV to me.
And how much are you, would you just put everything in there if the progression from one thing to the other is not logical? So if the CV is not telling a clear, logical story of, I started doing this, and then I did this sales job, and then I became a manager. So for example, in my case, I started with a sales job. I was on the phone, and then I became a manager, and then I became an account manager, then I became an operations manager. So when I moved from that type of work to finance, you can just about make a direct connection between a sales type role and a financial advisor type role, and then more management and things like that. And then eventually I started doing what I'm doing now. But if the progression is not very logical, that there's no clear story being told there, would you ever advise people to omit certain things to make it to make it a simpler story?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I probably wouldn't. But if you look at your resume or your CV and you go, I know this makes sense, but will someone reading it know it makes sense? Those are one of the few times where I'd advocate for a cover letter, and so you can actually tell them, hey, this is what happened. Here was my journey. Here's why it makes sense. And here's what I bring to the table. I'm one of those people that I always, I say, hey, if it comes out in a background check, if they can do, that kind of research and, show you were at a place, you want to throw it on there. But you do have the opportunity with a cover letter to kind of tell your story and say, hey, this is why I went from sales to finance. This is why it makes sense. And again, you're right. That one is probably a little bit easier to explain than some people. But yeah, I would include it, and I'd have a cover letter.
And how important is it for someone to have clearly thought out what their career story is? So, is this something, if you don't put it on a cover letter, if you don't actively try to explain, this is how I've gotten to be doing what I'm doing today,
yeah,
is it always going to come up? Is it going to come up in the recruiter's or the interviewer's mind and you're just not addressing it? So how does that work in your view?
It depends on the person's story. It depends on their career. I would say the more outside the box it is, the more like you look back on your career and go, whoa, that was a crazy turn, the more it's going to come up. If you have a pretty standard career that follows a very linear pattern, then it probably won't come up. But if there's a gap, if you made a big career change, if you took what is perceived as a step back, they are always going to be thinking it, because every hiring manager will ask a recruiter, hey, why did they do this? And as a recruiter, one of the last things you want is to go, I don't know, because then you look like an idiot. So, everyone's thinking it. So the more outside the box it is, the more it deviates from what you would consider to be a standard career progression, the more I would advocate for having some sort of story to explain it.
And if that's the case, how much would that story how much would that story just be, how much would it be just the truth? And how much would it be something that perhaps you might want to apply some creativity to? And I don't mean making stuff up. What I mean is, and this is something you see a lot on people who, anyone who's done any type of storytelling work. So either because people in the storytelling field or someone who's sat down with a ghostwriter type of person or someone. I'm thinking of Amy Blaschka, who you probably know from LinkedIn. So Amy will help people figure out their career story.
Yeah.
When you do that exercise, you find reasons that perhaps you never thought about before, and maybe they are perfectly correct reasons. And sometimes it's just, if I really look for a reason why I went from here to there, I can probably find one, even though when it did happen, it was kind of random. So my question is, would it just be, I was doing this job and I was looking for a new challenge, and then my cousin told me at Christmas there was this opening for this thing. So that, that would you want craft a story that, in a sense, implies a sense of purpose and direction if that wasn't there to begin with?
It sounds a whole heck of a lot better, right? Yeah. I think the big thing is that you want it to sound like it was intentional. And you want to know going into the interview. The last thing you want is when someone asks you the question to then on the spot try to come up with a reason that makes sense. If you know what you're going to say, I think that's half the battle. The more compelling, the more you've kind of juiced it up so it's interesting and there was some guiding light bringing you to your next opportunity. That's really up to your discretion. But yeah, I do think it makes sense to have reason and to know what it is ahead of time, because there's truth and then there's context to that. And I think you just want to be able to speak to that in the moment.
So what you're suggesting is that people should practice. They shouldn't just wing the stuff.
Yeah. I would say that's good advice. Pretty
well, I like
good advice.
I like the idea of always trying to find purpose or a narrative thread into things. For example, so my wife is my high school sweetheart, but she hasn't been my girlfriend all along. We were together for a couple of years, and then how I remember it happening was that she got tired of me and dumped me. And then we weren't together for 5 years, and then eventually we got back together. But if I try very hard, I can say that, you know, it wasn't the right time for us to stay together forever when we were 18. And then it was, clearly written in the stars that we would separate and would come back together again when the time for that was right. That's better than she just dumped me and went partying for 5 years. And then when she got tired, she's like, that's a sure thing. I'll just go back there.
Yeah, they're not making that first story into a rom-com. I think the second one's got a shot.
Yeah, yeah,
The first one.
yeah. Maybe I need to rethink how I'm telling my relationship story. Okay, so one of the reasons that I wanted you on the show was because I have been working with an MBA, and one of the things the MBA does is they have this. There's the communications course, which is the one I'm really involved with, but there's also the careers part of the course, and these are just a whole bunch of different things to help you in your career, and that includes recruitment. So some of the exercises that they had the students do, and some of them I helped facilitate, were preparing them for talking to interviewers and answering some questions that are, I guess, fairly basic. Like, for example, tell me about yourself, or strengths, weaknesses, achievements, that type of thing.
Yeah.
So first I wanted to ask you, in your experience, how common those questions still are. I mean, the people commonly sitting down in front of an interviewer and being asked, tell me about yourself.
I mean, that's incredibly common. I think if you've got 10 interviews, you might get asked that question in 9 of them. And the reason I think it is that common is it's such an easy introduction. I think when people interview, people don't like interviewing, first and foremost. They don't have to do it that often, and most people aren't expert interviewers. But the thing that most people don't think about is that people interviewing you, often they aren't experts either. Maybe a recruiter is, but if you get to a hiring manager, it's a small part of their job. A bigger part of their job is actually doing their job. And occasionally they add someone to their team. So when they ask you a question like, tell me about yourself, it's just an easy question for them to ask. Where they go, okay, how do I start this awkward 1-hour conversation and learn a little bit about this person in the process? And I think that's what it comes down to. So I'd say it's pretty common. I always tell people, if someone asks you, tell me about yourself, the perfect way to respond is, okay, where would you like me to start? Because you don't know if they want you to be like, well, I was born in Plymouth, Massachusetts. From there, I had a harrowing journey across the Midwest. Or do they want you to say, I graduated from Parkside with a business degree. I went straight into recruiting. Here we are 10 years later.
So do you think that when people ask that question, it's not, they're not this is their version of, how are you? How did you get here? Do you think it's more like an icebreaker than a genuine question where they're looking for any real insight into the candidate?
So I would say it's a little bit of A and B. It is certainly an icebreaker. It's the icebreaker of questions, but it's also a great chance to assess communication skills in a low pressure setting. In some ways, if I was an interviewer, I'd view it as a warm-up pitch. Like, okay, let me get my bearings here. Let me get used to talking without messing up or saying something and put my foot in my mouth. It's a when I ask questions like, hey, tell me about yourself, and I don't do it that often, but if I do, I'm assessing, okay, how strong is their communication skills? How direct and to the point are they? So I'd say yes and no. In some ways, it's a warm up, but you can definitely ruin an interview if you start that off the wrong way. So it's not without consequence.
So what is the wrong way? What is the wrong way to start that?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably a lot of wrong ways. If you said, Ben, give me a really wrong way to ask it, you could start off talking about something inappropriate, something political. I mean, you could go, oh, well, where the hell do you want me to start? That might be.
I'll get started soon. I'm just a bit gassy today. Just give me a moment. Oh, shouldn't have had a taco. Yeah. So I mean,
yeah. I mean, they might be able to relate. They also might perceve that as a bad way to start.
Yes, I would guess so.
Yeah, most likely.
Right. Okay. So the reason I'm asking about that question in particular is because, so in the MBA, what we were training the students to do is to have a story, or a story that they would have adjusted to that role specifically, that showed them in a light that they thought was favorable. So we were telling them to do things like, okay, you probably just have between 1.5 to 3 minutes here before it starts getting out of hand. So you need to be able to say something meaningful about yourself that sounds natural, but also impart some useful information. So I don't know, you're applying for a leadership position. So you could say something like, I started working straight out of college, and I was really interested in the jobs I did. But in the first couple of companies that I worked at, what really got me inspired wasn't so much the job. It was the managers I had, because I was very lucky to have some very good managers that took me under their wing and taught me a lot. And I have spoken to many people that have had the opposite experience. So I'm very aware of how important that part of the job is. And as I've grown in my career, I've always felt passionate about that, and it's a direction I definitely want to go into now, something along those lines. So would you ever train or suggest to candidates that they need to have a story like that?
Yeah, first of all, let me just say I love everything you just said. I love that the MBA course is teaching this. I completed my MBA like a year and a half ago. Not a single second was spent talking about how you could answer a question like this. I love that. And the length at which you have to be effective and impart your story, perfect. And then, yeah, I mean, I completely think that hits home, right? It kind of positions you and shows your motivation, your passion, your interest, and your why behind it. And then if you can finish it up with some of the relevant information about like things you've done in your career, yeah, that's perfect. I love that. If people can do exactly what you said, and in 3 minutes, 1.5 to 3 minutes, hit home about, hey, this is a little bit about me. Here's what I want to do, and here's my experience. That's a perfect recipe for nailing that question. I love it.
It's good that you answer that way, because if you said, no, that is complete tosh, there's absolutely no use to that, I might have to edit that out of the episode. Otherwise, I would have the MBA students going, I've just heard your podcast and I would like to talk about my tuition.
Yeah, no,
Give some of it back.
I love it. That is honestly, I think that's such a benefit. I don't know what, coursework is over, in Spain, but in America, sometimes we have all these different courses, and I'm like, what about some of these really valuable life courses you could probably do? And, like different realistic finance courses or interviewing and stuff like that. And that stuff is so actionable. And we just don't have any of that. And I love that. It's awesome.
I'm curious about how common that is. I mean, IESE, which is the MBA I'm involved with, is one of the top, at least as of last year, one of the top 10 MBAs in the world. Now, I don't know if their approach is very common in the MBAs of that level or not, but I was pleasantly surprised when I started working with them in how, when they talk about communications, they understand that involves public speaking and that involves storytelling. So the fact that these things are being taught at the very beginning of the course, I mean, I think it might have been the first course that the students have taken, or at least one of the first courses, because they expect that as they go through the MBA, they are going to use the skills. So might as well get them practicing them straight on. So tell me about yourself was one of the questions that they practiced for. And then everybody was expected to do that. And then the other ones that they got shown, but then ended up practicing, I think more the one they felt less comfortable about was the whole, strengths and weaknesses. Okay. And you and I had a quick conversation about that. And are these still being asked?
Yeah, I would say they definitely are. I think the question, what is your greatest weakness, is asked in a variety of different ways too. I mean, there's a handful of different ways you can ask that question. If you want the remix, if you want a different version, they have it, and it's still pretty common. And I would like to go on record publicly saying that I hate that question personally, because I don't think it tells you, does a person do the job effectively? Is this person able to come in and perform? I think it's one of those gotcha questions, but they are still very commonly used. So you have to know how to answer them. That's the reality of it.
I must admit that the weakness question was my favorite one of the ones to try, because the strength question is kind of obvious, right? You're going to talk
Yeah.
about stuff. You have to brag in a nice way. But the weakness question is a horrible one because it's very difficult not to fall under one of two camps. One of them is the humble brag. Oh, my weakness is that I focus too much on work or whatever.
Right.
And the other, I take work too seriously. And the other camp is where you said something horrendous without realizing that you've said something horrendous. I can imagine you probably have lots of stories about this one, but I had one of the students. He said something like, "Well, I'm I don't find it very easy to connect with people emotionally. So sometimes there will be something I'll be upset about, or I'll be a little frustrated about, and I won't find it easy to talk to people about that. And up until this point, I'm thinking, okay, fine, this is a fair thing to be saying as a weakness. And then it says, and I just won't talk about it, and then I won't talk about it until I kind of explode. Uh, so, and he went on a bit, and he went on a bit at that point. And so I was asking everybody at the end of the feedback sessions, okay, was that a humble brag? And people are like, definitely not. What's the worst possible interpretation of that? And someone said, wow, he would probably be very difficult to work with because he would be a drama queen and he would just be, having a hissy fit or a nervous breakdown all the time. And the guy was like, really? Is that what you got from that? I was like, yep.
Oh, yeah. And I think one of the things that's interesting too is there's been a bigger emphasis recently, I think, in hiring on making sure that people are good for your team. They're good teammates. And you look at some of the popular books that are more widely circulated now, like The Five Dysfunctions of Team and The Ideal Team Player, and some of the Patrick Lencioni books, which I think more and more people are incorporating into their hiring practices. And a lot of that comes to like, are you a good teammate? Are you someone that we can work with without wanting to bang our heads against the wall? So I think you do have to be careful there. But you're right. It's about threading that needle. It's about saying something that isn't ridiculous, like, oh, my greatest weakness is I spend too much money buying gifts for my coworkers. Like, that's a ridiculous thing to say. Or, well, I have a problem with lighting things on fire. It's finding that sweet spot, something realistic, but isn't damning in terms of your ability to do the job. And every job's different, so you have to find out what that is. But it is a challenging one. It's why it still exists. It is hard.
You talked about lighting things on fire, and I remember that when I was working at a call center, and I think I was an operations manager at the time, and I had this habit of calling people into my office, usually because they were doing well and I wanted to congratulate them, but I would never tell them why I was calling them in.
Yeah.
So I would just call them in, and they say, well, my boss's boss has just called me in, and they would walk in, and I would say, Ben, why have I called you in here today? And I would just shut up. And the weirdest stuff came out. And
I bet.
One day, a guy said, "Oh, I'm really sorry. I didn't really mean it. I was not really gonna firebomb that old lady's house." And it turned out that he had gotten flustered in a sales call, and then the argument escalated with him and this old lady. And then he actually said, "I know where you live. I'm gonna come around and firebomb your house."
Wow. That
yeah. So definitely a weakness, that one, I'm thinking.
Right. Yeah. You can't threaten old women. That's usually frowned upon in just about every work setting.
Yeah, but what is a good weakness? Because it's very difficult to find something that you couldn't blow out of proportion.
Yeah.
Like I could say, and this is a genuine weakness. It's one of the reasons I'm less interested in managing a large team myself. Is, well, I like to give people autonomy, and I like to treat people as adults and know that they have, I expect results. I don't expect to micromanage them. I don't want to micromanage them. But that doesn't always work terribly well, because not everybody thrives under a manager that lets them get on with stuff. Sometimes people need closer monitoring, and that's all true, right? And that's a genuine weakness. I would consider it a weakness of mine. But if the job involves managing a large team, it's very easy to hear that and go, Well, so you're essentially saying you're going to let your people get on with it, and if they're not doing the work, then tough luck for the
Right.
company.
Yeah.
So what is a good weakness?
Yeah. And, it's funny because it's kind of like a key. It's like saying, what's a good key? Well, it depends on the door. It depends on the lock. So, my advice here is to find whatever profession you're in and find a commonly accepted weakness of people who still succeed in that role, right? So, if you're a salesperson, salespeople don't always have the best attention to detail because they're more driven and they're more aggressive. But you're willing to accept if, oh, they forgot to mail in this, this expense report or something like that. So I would say you find something that is a reasonable but commonly accepted weakness in your chosen profession and talk about that. And for me, I'm a leader of people. I work in recruitment, and my profile is one that happens to have a not a great attention to detail. And I could say, for me, I'm always focused on big picture. I'm moving quickly, so sometimes some of the small details, I don't do the best job of staying on top of them. So what I have to do is really build in systems so that I don't let that get out of hand. Whether that's setting calendar reminders or having notes for myself, that's what I need to do to mitigate any possible negative, impact of me having bad attention to detail. So I think that's the key. Find something that in your chosen career field isn't terrible, is accepted, and talk about how you're managing to, offset that issue with another positive behavior.
The weakness that they gave as an example in the course, and then most people ended up using that as their own weakness because I don't know, they struggled finding something that was more original and not terrible, was something like, I sometimes struggle to make a decision if I feel I don't have all of the necessary information. So which again,
Yeah.
but it to me felt like that one was like focus grouped. Like you
Right.
cannot. This is definitely not a humble brag. You cannot
Yeah.
really take this the worst possible way. But
Right.
it didn't feel like much like something a normal real person would say.
Right. Well, and I would say that interviews are never won with that question, but they are lost with that question. So finding something like that that's relatively vanilla and like, isn't going to wow the person, but also isn't going to like get you kicked out of the interview room is probably a safe way to go. They go, okay, let's move on. Nobody hires someone based off the answer to that question, but people do get ruled out because they say something that is one way or the other on either side of it. So I like that one. It's a good one.
So let's swing back to more of the story based stuff, and one of the ways that we tended to describe it to them or teach them to do this was this. They made a distinction between achievements and strengths. I think they consider strength as something you have. So say you have attention to detail, you have initiative, you whatever. Whereas an achievement was more on the basis of something you've done, right? And when we were trying to use storytelling for those things, what we quickly figured out was we wanted to give them as specific a moment or details as we could for both the strengths and the achievements. We didn't want good storytelling for the weakness. Because the one thing storytelling will do for sure if you do it properly is make things more memorable. So the last thing you want is
Yeah.
describe a perfect situation where your weakness came to the fore and you screwed something up, because they will definitely remember that. So in a sense, I said to them, guys, this is the one moment where you can use corporate bullshit speak because you want that to be vanilla and bland. But for the strengths and the achievements, what we said was, okay, give me the one exact situation where the strength was on display. So if you're going to talk about leadership, what we said to them is, don't say, I've led teams for many years and blah, blah, blah. But you can say that, but then say, this happened in my last job. And this is what, to me, leadership is about. The project was running late. We had this problem or that problem. And then I was talking to John, who was my one of the people working for me, and blah, blah, blah. Right. And then this was happening, and then we tend to say, don't give overviews if they ask for a strength, because the story will make it more memorable. Thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's going to stick in your head. Yeah, you don't want to elaborate too much on weakness. Like a long, drawn out story there is not going to help you. But I agree. I ask a lot about strengths. And I ask a lot about most significant career achievement. That's a question that I always ask. And I always then break it down. I peel back the layers. So I love the idea of having a story because if someone says, hey, this is my biggest career achievement, it doesn't end there, not with me and not with a lot of good interviewers. They're going to go, okay, when did that happen? Who was involved? What went wrong? What did you learn from it? If you could do something different, what would you do? What was the very specific outcome? And I think having a story in which it's rehearsed, you know what you're going to say, it gives a broader picture of what exactly took place, helps you answer that question effectively. So I agree completely. I think that's good strategy.
What we decided they should do was, again, they should make it a story. So it's not, well, I ran this project which won whatever award and whatever. It's like, okay, fine. It might be impressive on its own right, but it's a lot better if you say, so when I joined the company in China, they were trying to win this big contract. And the reason why this was so important was because if you don't have this type of benchmark project, then the agency is not taken seriously, and they hadn't really won one for years, which was starting to look a bit shifty. So when I came in, that's what they landed on my plate. And then I looked at my team, no one had any idea what to do. And then blah, blah, blah. And then I did this, and then I did that. And then it almost went wrong, but went right. And eventually we got it. And then after that, we won 3 projects in quick succession. Not me, but the agency, but on the back of being able to use the one I won as the proof of concept for a work or something like that. So that was the type of stuff we were saying, and find one moment where the thing turned, right? So the one moment where you're talking to John or Sally or Jen or whoever, just create and have someone else to have dialogue with, because that will make it memorable. Because otherwise, you're just giving an overview with more detail.
Yeah, and when interviewers are asking a question like that, one of the things they're looking for, they're using is the STAR method, and that's situation, task, action, and result. And it sounds like from what you told me, I mean, you're covering those bases. Here's the situation, you're providing appropriate context. Here was the task that needed completed. Here was my specific action, and then here was the result. Whenever you're telling a story like that, it's important you do that. And I think the last thing about the stories of why it's so important is it makes it believable. So many times when you ask someone, what was your most significant accomplishment in your career? The concern from someone interviewing them is that they're not being entirely forthright, or they're taking somebody else's achievement or a team's achievement and making it theirs. And when you're bereft on the details, when there's not a lot of information, you tend to believe that. But if you turn it into a story, I think it gives it a lot more validity. I would hear that and go, yeah, he definitely did that. That happened. So I think there's value in it in a lot of ways. From someone who asks that question a lot, I love it.
I guess the problem that a lot of people face when they're trying to describe achievements is they're not telling a story, for one, but also they're not using the elements of story that would tell your brain, you should pay attention to this. And the elements, or at least the most commonly agreed elements, are a time and location stamp. So, it was this year, it was this place. You have people doing things, so it's not a company. You have one thing that leads to another, and there is some element of surprise or aha or whatever, something along those lines at the end. And when it comes to structure, you talked about STAR, but most stories people talk about like a 3-act story, which is always going to be the setup and then the problem and then the outcome, or the consequences. I had John Livesey, it was the first ever episode on the show, and he likes to describe, I think he calls it exposition, problem, solution, resolution, which is basically the same thing, right? If you follow that type of structure and you put in the right details, then you end up with something that feels real. If you don't have it, then I think the brain just doesn't quite get that this is an experience you're sharing, because it's not following the right format. And, true or not, you're just not getting the same effect, I would guess.
Right. I mean, one of the most annoying things, like just to be candid, when you're interviewing someone, is you're asking them questions and it's so vague and they're just missing details. And then you've got to dig in. Well, what about this? Well, what about that? What about that? If someone can answer a question in a way that already accomplishes all those things, it's just so much better, I think, for the flow of the interview. And I think overall, it'll give the person interviewing the candidate a much stronger perception of them. So yeah, I think generally speaking, if people can incorporate that, it'll be so much better for the answering that question.
Yeah, the specifics are key. And there's something about the lack of specifics, which is probably why corporate speak becomes corporate bullshit, which is, it just never sounds like real life. It's,
Right.
we've worked really hard to align our priorities and, deliver the project in whatever. It's just like, okay, fine, but how much better is it if you say, well, when I came into the project, we were spending most of our time doing this and not that. And we were just not getting the results we needed. So when we stopped, we were kind of focused on the right things, and then we did this and we did that. And then within a few months, this happened. And you kind of go, okay, fine, that sounds like something that actually happened and not something out of a corporate brochure.
The communication is so much stronger in the example you gave. I mean, it's so much better. And I think communication in so many roles is key. And as someone who's involved in interviewing, I'm always assessing communication because it's so important. You're going to be talking with, your team, internal customers, potentially external customers. The strength of communication is something that is always valuable, in my opinion.
What is the achiever pattern?
Yeah, the achiever pattern is something I look for, and a lot of hiring managers look for it too. But it's someone who has shown and demonstrated success in prior roles. Now, one of the dead giveaways is if someone is promoted. So they're at a company and you see they were promoted 2 times in a 5-year period. That doesn't happen if a person is doing a poor job. If they're showing up, they're mailing it in, they're getting in fights with their coworkers, they're firebombing old ladies' houses, they are not demonstrating the achiever pattern. But you see someone making progressions, making a significant impact, that is the achiever pattern. And I think when I think about storytelling and how it can improve someone's chances of landing a job, we as recruiters can look at a resume and see achiever pattern. But you have the opportunity to talk about your achievements on a job and fit yourself into that narrative of being someone who fits the achiever pattern if you can adequately share your story.
I got this thing the other day, or mass WhatsApp or whatever, and it was a CV. It was on LinkedIn. It was someone's work experience on LinkedIn from McKinsey, and the way the person described his experience was he was an associate, and then under responsibilities he wrote, "I make pretty slides." And then his next position was associate manager, and he said, "I tell people to make pretty slides." And then he became whatever comes after associate manager in McKinsey, and he was, "I convince clients pretty slides generate real results."
That's pretty straightforward, pretty to the point there.
I mean, that the story being told there is very compelling.
Oh yeah, it really draws you in. Yeah.
Well, let's turn this around a bit. So we've been talking about the questions you were asked and how you respond to them. But when it comes to both your role as a recruiter and the company side, do you have to tell, or should you tell, stories to potential recruits about the companies they might be joining? Does the company try to do that when they're offering roles or when they're presenting roles to interesting candidates?
Yeah, I feel super strongly about this, actually. Every company should. Every time one of my clients says to me, "Ben, I need you to help me find blank," I talk about the role, but I always tell them the second most important thing we're going to talk about during the entire call is your EVP, and that's employee value proposition. And that's why someone should want to come work here. The reality is the best candidates will always have opportunities. And oftentimes, it's going to come down to your story. The role will be similar. The impact will be similar. The qualifications, the pay, the benefits will often be similar. But what is it that makes your company worth working? And that's the storytelling. All my recruiters on my team that I manage, we all have to tell stories about the role, about the company, about why someone who isn't looking for a job, because we go after people who are not looking. We go after people who are in their current role, top 25% performers. They're succeeding, and they had no idea when they woke up that day that they might be having a conversation about leaving a job. You need a compelling story to make someone go, yeah, okay, Ben, I will talk to you for 15 minutes and hide out in my car in the parking lot and hear about this other company. So yeah, companies need to do that because if you aren't telling a compelling story, your competition is.
How much easier is a recruiter's life now that nobody needs to hide under the car in the parking lot?
Yeah, a little bit easier. It's a funny thing, in the situation because there are less people hiring. But if you can hire, I mean, we are getting a hold of people very easily. People are much more willing to take a call from their living room than they are from their cubicle. So yeah, a lot easier to answer your question directly.
When we're talking about stories that companies can use for recruitment, we were talking about that, and I remember something I've heard the other day. So this was a guy who had just started in a law firm, and he saw that as, this was in Australia. He saw that as a stepping stone. So he had he had his eyes on a bigger law firm for another year or two in his career, and he was working in bankruptcy or insolvency. And essentially, what he had to do was he had to prepare all the paperwork for a large bank to serve insolvency papers to one of their providers, but he got it the wrong way round. So the small provider was serving insolvency papers to one of the largest banks in Australia. So he did the paperwork, it got delivered, the bank received it, and then called back the law firm. So as you can understand, this is the type of cock up that completely, easily cost someone their job. There was a board meeting happened to deal with the problem. He knew that one of the major partners was flying in from head office. So he was inside the company, and then the lift door opens, and he sees the senior partner come out of the lift, look at him straight, and walk down the long hallway, straight at him, and it's like, this is it. This is when I'm losing my job. And the senior guy just stops in front of him, puts his hand on his shoulder, and says, "Are you okay? We'll sort this out. Mistakes happen, but are you all right?" And that was it. They sorted it out. The bank was okay. They didn't lose the bank as a client. And he said, "I'm still there. I'm still in that company."
Yeah.
So whenever someone asks me why, I tell them this. And I heard that, and I thought, I mean, if you had 2 or 3 stories like that you could tell a potential recruit, and you just say, would that happen in your job?
Yeah. I mean, that's a powerful story. I mean, I was visualizing it the entire time. I feel like in my mind, I saw the elevator. I was like imagining a hallway. I'm a big advocate of asking questions when you're interviewing. When you're a candidate, asking questions is one of the most powerful tools you have. And I create videos all the time on here's questions you should ask. And I'm just imagining if someone said, hey, tell me about a time where you made a mistake in your organization and how was it handled? If that is how you're able to answer that question as a hiring manager, it doesn't get more home run than that. I mean, it's a great answer. And it really shows, how they handle challenging situations and the loyalty to their people, which, is everybody wants that.
And if you have collected those stories and you have them as a company, as a recruiter to provide to potential employees or new employees, it will avoid doing this nerve-wracking thing that I heard you talk about the other day, where you're saying that our candidate could ask, is it okay if I call some people in the company to just, get their feel
Right.
for how it is working there? Now, I imagine that a lot of larger companies would not feel comfortable with that at all.
Right.
Is it a common thing for candidates to ask for that? And if it is it common for the companies to go, yeah, sure, speak to whoever you want?
I don't think it's a common tactic at all. I think it's a good tactic, but I think it's underused. And, I put in my videos, like, you should ask them. And I think asking them is nice because it's a tell. If the hiring manager goes, oh, yeah, go ahead, it means they're probably a pretty good manager and their people don't hate them. It's pretty obvious. If they're a terrible manager, they go, oh, man, if they call any of my people, they're going to tell them all these terrible things about me. But I don't think enough people do it. But the reality is you don't have to ask. If you genuinely just want the information, you can message people and say, hey, do you have a minute? I wanted to talk about your organization. I've personally done that. I've had people do it with me. But yeah, I don't think it's common at all. I think it's good. I don't think it's common.
I had a friend who, let's just say he didn't behave himself perhaps the way he should when he was out and about. And every time one of us was talking to his girlfriend, he would go, "Well, what are you talking about? What did you say?" "Oh, she was just asking, about when the barbecue the other day, because it was just the guys." And "Well, what'd you say? But did you tell her? Did you tell her we went out afterwards?" "Yeah." And she asked, and I said yes. Like, "Oh no, what did you say? Oh, please." It's not that's the biggest tell, is if every time your friends are talking to your partner, you are very concerned about what conversations are taking place, or if your employees are talking with potential recruits, that suggests that maybe you should rethink some of your practices.
That's a dead giveaway there. Dead giveaway for sure.
Oh, yeah. And the last question I had for you was, with regards to references. Do you have some bizarre stories about people who gave references that perhaps they shouldn't have given, or people whose background when checked didn't turn out to be what it was supposed to be?
Over the course of the last decade in recruitment, they all kind of blend together. But I can't tell you how many times someone gives a reference, and then you call that person and they're like, "Oh, I would never hire this person. This person was terrible. They were not a good employee. They were lazy. I wouldn't hire them back." And it's so puzzling to be like, "Are you telling me that you don't have a single person? Like, you don't have 3 people after your entire career who will only say positive things about you?" But it honestly happens all the time. It happens all the time. You got to check in with your references, people. Before you give them to someone, call them up and go, "Hey, I've got a new opportunity I am really excited about. It's really important to me. I really enjoyed our time together. Would you be a reference for me?" And if there is any hesitation, do not put that person down. Find somebody else.
I used to work in a company that had a lot of turnover. And then we would get called in and ask for references about people. And now, I don't remember if I did this or if I just wanted to do it, but sometimes they would ask about, how was Ben? And my first reflex was just go, and I'm pretty sure some people did that. And that's why the company at some point said, "I can tell you he worked here." "Yeah, but can you tell me?" "No, I can tell you he worked here between this time and that time. That's all I can tell you." And it's like, "But he was a great guy." No. Either we do that for everyone or we do it for no one. So no proper references of behavior or anything like that. Which again, the fact that the company had to implement that policy suggests that perhaps I should have spent less time working for them.
Yeah, probably.
Right. Where if people want to know more about the stuff you're doing, or watch any of the many things you put out about recruitment and talent and interviewing, what's the good place to go?
Yeah, my YouTube channel is actually relatively new. It's Ben Talks Talent, and now I put all my videos there. So it's a great way if you want to access my entire library of interviewing and hiring advice. They're all 3 to 5 minute videos, and they're all there. So I would say Ben Talks Talent on YouTube, or to find me on LinkedIn. I put out content every single day.
Ben, it's been good fun, and we've gotten quite a lot out of this one. So thanks very much for your time, mate.
Yeah, I had a great time. Thank you for having me.
All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves, and until next time. I hope you enjoyed the show. And if you did, I'd love for you to subscribe and leave us a review or a rating on the Apple Podcasts app. It's very easy. You open the app and find this show. Then scroll down a little, and when you see the stars, tap. I'd really appreciate it, and it does help other people find us. And if you'd like to get in touch or find out more about what I do, reach out to me on LinkedIn or visit my website, storypowers.com.